Thank you, Simon.
Thank you so much for coming to the studio. I really appreciate it.
Very welcome.
And, firstly, I'll say we've been long-time friends.
Well, I think friends might be a strong word, but I've known you quite a long time, yeah.
Should we say acquaintances?
Okay.
Okay, all right. Thanks for settling on that. But yeah, I was excited to see about your new role at Diversity Role Models. And as the new CEO, I'd love you just to, just talk about, and that's why I wanted you to come in, so we can have a chat about that role and sort of why you decided to choose it. I can see it's probably something that's really important to you. So, what led you to taking that role there?
So I was working in education for well over 20 years, post-16 education. And during the pandemic, I think many people had a chance to reflect, to simply ask the question, is this what I want to continue doing, or is there some other challenge out there for me? And I came to the conclusion, albeit slowly, like many did, that I wanted to do something different. However, you doing something different, you try to go out and look for a match to your background and your skills. So I was looking for a charity. Most definitely, I like working in the charitable sector, and something aligned to education. And then the role at Diversity Role Models, who I'd never heard of, incidentally, before I saw the advertisement came up, and I just thought, that is definitely for me. It has strong educational ethos. It's a charity, and it is at the forefront, the age-long struggle for equality. And in this case, the equality for LGBTQ plus young people and adults.
Because I can only imagine that you were at your previous role for 11, 12 years, something like that. It was a while, I think.
It was longer. I was managing director there for 11 years,
right,
but nearly 18 in total.
And I think you're absolutely right in the fact that a lot of people have then been looking at their roles and thinking, is this the right match? Is this the right thing for me? I think there's something going on at the moment which they're calling the Great Resignation. But I'm seeing this in business at the moment, which is a lot of people are certainly changing roles, and it's very hard to bring in the right talent because it's just so highly competitive. So people are really questioning, is this the right employer for me? So I can definitely see that's one of the things that's certainly come out of COVID is this the right place for me? So I can certainly understand, you having a look around. But I think it's exciting also. I mean, the fact that you've been able to go in there as the CEO as well, did that play a part in your decision making?
Yeah, definitely. I think I've said to you, there's no substitute for being the boss. It is the opportunity to impress upon an organisation your own personal culture and to lead in the creation of something. And whilst it's not always plain sailing, that's a very rewarding place to be. And I think there are many people out there, private sector or charitable or public, who once they've had an established period of being a boss, maybe their own boss, find the prospect of not being the boss a real challenge. Not to say that doesn't happen, of course, but certainly from my perspective, I felt I had spent so long being the executive in a charity that I knew how to do it.
How do you feel? I'll talk about the role first as just being CEO, because I also sometimes look at that role and think how daunting it is. I look at the CEO today in Livingstone and think that it's so challenging as a job. There's, you've got the shareholders at the board, you've got the Carlyle, the investment group, you've got, a business that's going through a significant transformation, and it's all lying on one person to make the changes and make a lot of decisions. And I just think, wow, I mean, to take it on is number one, but also then to try to execute against it. When you look at that role, is there parts of that you find daunting, or you think, or is it motivating that you look at that big challenge?
The hardest part of leadership is people, pure and simple, because people are varied. They have their own ambitions, strengths, areas for development. You, in my case, walk into an existing culture. So I think any role that involves relationships with people is always going to be a challenge. But as a CEO, I think I've always was taught many years ago that a leader's role is to drive improvement through others. So if a CEO thinks, I'm it, I can change everything, it's maybe not likely that they'll succeed. So to build a team around you of individuals who are certainly capable, share your vision, but I think then most importantly are also different from you, is a sound basis for success. So the position I'm in as CEO is establishing that. So getting to know the team so that I can build relationships with them. And then within the leadership team, build a vision they could subscribe to. Help me understand how their differences to me can be a real strength in decision making. And then empower them to make the improvements or drive the performance for me. And that's the only formula that's ever worked for me. So at the heart of this has to be all those really strong interpersonal skills that people look for in a leader. At the one end, you've got effective decision-making and clarity in decision-making. At the other end, you've got that kind of collaborative approach where people feel that their voice is heard and the decisions being made reflect them and they can see their influence on it. And being able to deploy those two ends of the spectrum, which are effectively, this is my decision, go and do it, right through to what do we all think? Is there a consensus here? Okay, I don't necessarily agree with this, but we're going to go with it. Be able to deploy those two ends of the spectrum at the appropriate time, I think, for me personally, is what is always on my mind. And that in my last job, where bar one or two people, I'd appointed everyone or promoted them and knew them and all their characteristics. That was a really comfortable position for me. For anyone who goes into a new leadership role where you don't know anybody, working that out and building those relationships, that credibility with that team, that's kind of your first hurdle. And that can take a minimum of a year to effectively do.
Wow. How do you feel about the responsibility, knowing that all responsibility, all decisions ultimately come down to yourself? And of course, you're having to make a decision. Quite often you don't have all of the information. And I don't know how you would make a lot of those decisions without, there's always going to be gaps. There's always going to be missing information. How do you feel about that responsibility?
I suppose I'm used to it. And the pandemic is an extreme example of finding yourself in a position of leadership where there is nobody who can say, I've been through this. And you are drawing upon everything that's gone in your life before that might give you the tiniest fraction of confidence of what you do next. So the responsibility is, of course, significant. But you're only going to succeed as a leader if you're comfortable taking on that responsibility. If you're not, quit. So when I'm in a position and you don't have the full facts, you are kind of trying to draw upon everything that's happened before to fill in the gap. And then when there's still a gap and you've got to make a decision, all I can put it just down to, it is a quality that you have in leaders. That first and foremost, even without all the facts, they will make a decision, as opposed to prevaricate, as opposed to devolve responsibility. So they will make a decision. And they'll be able to explain why they've made that decision. And the simple fact of any CEO or any leader is we don't always know. It is a percentage of certainty or probability that comes into your head, and a willingness to be wrong. Not a desire, clearly, but a willingness to understand I might get this wrong. But at the moment in time, based on what I know now and based on all my experience, this decision I think is the right one.
So that leads me to a question, actually, because what happens if you don't make the decision? What's the impact on the people, the team? If there's indecision at the leadership level, what then happens?
Drift. The organisation drifts. There's a really good film, one of my favourite, called, it's got Russell Crowe, called Master and Commander. He's captain of a ship, early 19th century. And there's an officer on board who's not very effective. He's not popular. And there's an incident, and he goes to the captain's cabin and he explains to the captain, I'm trying to be friendly with the crew. And the captain says, they don't want friends, they want leadership. So the absence of decision making, just it leads to drift. Your team will resent you, you will be considered weak, and you'll ultimately fail, and probably fail quite horribly, because ultimately that is the job. The job of leadership is to make decisions.
I think one of the mistakes I made when I started moving into leadership was that friends piece. And of course, you need to be a leader. How do you think you get the right balance between getting on with the team, but also then leading the team at the same time? And how do you get that balance between the two? Because sometimes having, what am I thinking of? Constructive tension is a good idea, is a good thing. I certainly can do that with my customers. But having that with my team, I find that really challenging, to have that, to challenge someone or to push someone a bit. But then there's also that point just around, we're getting on well. And I made the mistake at the beginning of sort of mates, and, we go out and we'll have a few drinks or we'll do this. And I just thought, this doesn't feel right to me.
Sure.
So how do you get that balance right?
It is a common quandary for all leaders. And I have a couple of phrases. The first is, you can be friendly, but you're not friends. And there's a big difference between the two. Because really the only thing that unites people in a workplace is your contract of employment. It's a professional place. People are there to do a particular job. And obviously being able to do that in a friendly atmosphere is far better than an unfriendly one. But beyond that, that is it. Now, people of a similar level will become friends, of course. But ultimately, if you are the CEO or a leader or manager, you will be called upon to make decisions that impact adversely on anybody in the organisation. You cannot be seen to favour somebody, and you cannot find yourself in a position where a friend is a person you need to make redundant. And their accusation to you is, I thought we were friends. So there's a reason to say it's lonely at the top, because it is lonely at the top. You cannot manage through friendship, but you can be friendly.
You mentioned adversity, and before we talk about what I really want to talk to you about, which was diversity, role models, but let's talk about the adversity you've been through. Maybe we can talk through COVID. How did in your previous organisation, how did you cope with COVID? Because I know there was quite a significant change, I think, in your business previously, of what happened there. I think with people working from home, going from the office, I think there was obviously, just like all organisations, starting remote. I remember I was working with one of my larger clients at the time, and a large global bank, and they were about 100,000 employees. And we was talking to them about digital transformation and also just transforming how people work. And the feedback that they said was that we were trying to promote working from home, for lots of different benefits. And they said over a quarter of a weekend, we went from 10,000 home workers to 100,000 home workers. And they just had to deal with it. There was no other choice. They just had to make that change. How did you implement some of those changes, and how did you find the COVID scenarios? How did they play out for you?
Well, necessity is the mother of invention. It was necessary to go from being a wholly classroom-based, face-to-face training organisation to wholly remote. And because the organisation contracted with the government, there wasn't really the option to put people on furlough. We had to continue trading. but we were sort of caught in a little bit of a trap because the contract relied just as much on doing the existing work. Our business relied on being able to bring in new work as well, and the new work simply stopped.
Right.
So it put great strain over the organisation's cash flow. I described it to the team as our model is a bucket with a hole at the bottom and a tap. And so long as the water coming in is at least the same as the water going out, we're fine. But under COVID, the tap was switched off. So there's still water in the bucket, but you can just see it draining. So for us, the challenge was we have our existing obligations. We've got several hundred apprentices we need to continue to train. And each of those apprentices have their own issues because of employers who may be putting them on furlough or experiencing their own difficulties. And at the same time, we have absolutely no new business coming in, and we have no idea when that new business will come in. So you, from my perspective, you kind of distill it down to that image, which is we'll just run out of money. We can't put people on furlough because the government has issued a contract to us and says you must fulfill the contract. So your costs are fixed, but your income is just vanishing before you. So it's a kind of acutely unusual problem compared to the charity I work for now. Everybody but the CEO went on furlough. They just kind of froze all their outgoings, as well as having a lot of their income frozen. But we were in a sandwich in a much less flexible position. So it had a significant effect operationally. We had to switch very quickly to a remote delivery, as did many organisations. We weren't unique in that. But also had to make some pretty sharp decisions about how could we buy time. And I would say on March the 20th or whenever it was that lockdown was initiated, I said, we're no longer in the business of training, we're in the business of buying time. We need to staunch that hole where the money's going out until some sort of plan is put in place, either at that stage, of course, some of us probably thought, oh, this will be over by June, or the government looks more broadly than it was doing at that stage. So it was a really acute problem. I think for any CEO or anyone in a position of leadership, it tested to your maximum every piece of resilience you'd built up.
What lessons have you taken from that? Because you've had to have, talking about it's going to be a 3-month period at the beginning. That's what a lot of us thought. There's a lot of us hoped. I mean, I think the first lockdown was 2 weeks, and then it started to change, and it was a bit longer. And of course, that period really increased. When you were looking at the longevity of how long it actually ended up lasting for, how did you last? Is the question, I suppose. How did you make the organisation to be resilient enough to be able to have the longevity to get through it ultimately?
I realised the only way we could buy time was to significantly reduce outgoings. But at the same time, we're tied into fulfilling our obligations. So I persuaded everyone to take a pay cut, a significant pay cut for 6 months.
How was that received?
I think we went through a process where people understood if we didn't do that, then you could potentially be talking about reducing roles. And in any small organisation, it's usually close-knit. There are these strong interpersonal relationships, which we think are essential. And people didn't want that to happen to their colleagues. So it was an acceptance of two choices, and everybody, myself included, it was across the board, everyone taking a pay cut was the least worst option. And you talk about it collectively, obviously online, and then you spend time with each individual because it was a choice. We chose not to say you will. It was very much a persuasion.
Right.
And, to their absolute credit, nobody refused. Everybody felt the same, which was, we need to keep this organisation going. We fulfil charitably a very key function in the local community. We believe this is short term, so we're taking pay cuts for a limited period. And I gave the commitment that should there be a bounce back, that we would repay that sacrifice, which eventually we were able to do. But of course, at the time, it does seem like a somewhat of a cursory promise. You have absolutely no idea, even if what you're doing is enough, never mind, could you pay it back? So it comes back down to that relationship piece, being able to articulate the problem in ways that people can really understand and empathise with, reassure them that this isn't, we're just going to do this and hope for the best, that there is a plan. And re-emphasise that what you're asking of everyone, you are doing exactly the same. So that people feel the leader is right in it with them.
I think that's an important thing, isn't it? That leadership is there in the trenches with them, because they don't want there to be, you can't have some disparity there. You've got to act in exactly the same way. And
I've never been a person to sit in an office on my own. I've always sat right in it with everybody to build. I think you get, I think there's a kind of a managerial asset, which is to pick up on lots of informal communication and intelligence, which is very helpful. Sat in an office, I think you can be quite isolated from that. You can see problems coming earlier than before it gets escalated to you, and you can intervene. But I think the greatest message is that feeling of, I don't consider myself anything other than part of the team.
I must say, I think that's absolutely incredible. I didn't know that was the approach that you took, but that for you to also be able to communicate it on a one-to-one basis, and everyone decided. I don't know how many people made that decision.
Maybe about 25, 26 then.
Yeah, for everyone to make that decision, of course, they, to understand why it needed to happen, and for everyone to take a pay cut, to be able to, and that must show also, by the way, that there's significant trust in the leadership, in yourself, to be able to, that they know that this is the right thing for the organisation, the right thing for the charity, and that ultimately it means it's going to reserve the longevity of the organisation. And actually, if you kept on your promises and you've paid back, you've given them some upside or given back some of that money, then that's where the trusting loop is closed, really. I think that's an incredible thing that you've done.
I think it underpins a philosophy I picked up many years ago, which is kind of transparent leadership. That if you equip people with everything, almost everything they invariably will agree with your decisions. And it is where you deny people access to that information that I think is at the heart of conflict. So I've always shared a kind of monthly financial position with all the team so they can understand the limitations that I'm working within when they say, well, we want to invest in this technology, or we want to talk about terms and conditions. They know before that even becomes a suggestion, well, this is kind of the constraints the organisation has to manage. So I think it was helpful that I'd always had that approach with the team, always knew the challenges we were facing, money in the bank, what the forecast was looking like. So then the decision almost became, well, if I was in your position, Matt, I'd probably do the same thing. And I carry that through, and I will always carry that through. That transparent leadership averts so many issues that other, perhaps more secretive leaders encounter frequently.
Well, I know in my career, the best leaders I worked with, they're transparent, and they're the ones I feel like they're sharing what they can share with me. And you know, and certainly with my team, I try and be as transparent and open as I possibly can. And I think that's the right way, because I think that really, that's what gains trust. Why do you feel it is so much in business that there's a lot of, I say a lot, there's just a lot of leaders that I would say that are not transparent. Because I feel that's a real detriment to the relationships you try to build. It's a real detriment to the organisations you work for. But there is a lot of people that are, or a lot of leadership that I've worked with that, yeah, they don't share everything. Very simply, that's, you know, that they're in a different position, and therefore you only get to find out so much. There's just not so much information that's shared. And I think for longevity, working somewhere, or it's just not the right, you know, not the best way. Why do you think it's some leadership people don't take that approach? It seems in some respects to be quite an open, quite an obvious thing that people need. Like, you wouldn't have a personal relationship, you know, with your wife or your husband or whoever that wasn't fully transparent. But then your business relationship often isn't like that.
I think the answer to start with is because they choose to. And, you know, this theme of choice will come through probably later in our discussion. So if a person is transparent, they're choosing to be. And if a person is secretive, they're choosing to be. Now, why they are secretive could be a number of things. If we were giving somebody the benefit of that, they may have shared stuff before and been betrayed and had their trust betrayed, and it's got a natural recoil from being in that position. It might be a fundamental insecurity, which is, well, at least you know, the harder it is for you to challenge me because you don't have the kind of basics of the information to challenge my decision making. It could be a power trip. You know, this is not just a job for me. I really enjoy the idea that I know more than you. So it could be a variety of things, but ultimately they're secretive because they choose to be. And that might be a feature of their whole life. Yeah.
It feels like that. It feels like it could be a part of their personality in some respects. I'm thinking of leaders that I've worked with in the past, and just think there's a reason why that didn't last long. You went to a different role, or, you know, or something else happened, and you just think the best leaders that I remember now, they were like, if I think about one of the leaders that I worked with, he was so transparent and so open, and I loved just the truth, which is, okay, this isn't that great, but this part over here is good. So therefore we have to focus on what is good. But let's be honest, you know, not every company, most companies have got loads of flaws. There's lots of flaws everywhere. And I think, and there's no perfect company. So it's about just being realistic and honest about those flaws or failures, and to say, okay, great, but there's these other things that are really great, and which let's focus on that. And I think that, yeah, by far the best leaders I worked with have been very transparent. Like, literally can ask any question and everything's open. So it's great to hear, because we've never really spoken about this before. So it's great to hear that. Let's come back to today and where we are with your new role. So we talked about you taking this new role. What's the organisation's mission? What are you trying to achieve?
Sure. So I'll give a little viewer warning. So we're going to talk about a story which is sad and has a reference to suicide. Okay. But it is at the heart of the creation of diversity role models. So some years ago, as a young lad called Dominic, he went on a school trip, a residential, and after the teachers had gone, he and others played Spin the Bottle, which is one of those games where if it lands on you, there's a dare, and he was dared to kiss a boy, which he did. And the game continued. Somebody filmed that, and within no time it was circulated, you know, through mobile phones, social media, across the whole school piece. And he was subject to severe bullying as a result, and killed himself as a consequence. It's a really sad story. Whether he was gay or not is irrelevant, and he literally was bullied to death, is what happened. And the impact upon his family clearly was severe, and the impact upon people who heard about it, whether it was at his school or his friends, people who are young people who are themselves LGBTQ plus, adults who had grown up being bullied, had a really understandably severe impact. And it motivated the founder of Diversity Role Models, a teacher called Saran, to work with supporters to create essentially a project. And that project's mission was to go into schools and get volunteer role models, people from all walks of life, in regular jobs, different ages, to talk about their experience growing up, living as being gay or trans, bisexual, across the whole community. The theory behind it's called contact theory, which is that if you come into contact with somebody who's different, speak to them, hear their story, it generates empathy within you and breaks down the stereotypes you might have had. And this was maybe 12 years ago. So although perhaps for me that doesn't seem a long time in the development of society, probably 12 years ago, most young people in a school would never have met an out LGBTQ person. So that all they'd have are stereotypes in their head or things, people, characters in the media. And the charities work from there. So the whole premise is that we are invited into schools. We run a workshop at the heart of which will be 2 volunteer role models who will tell their story, allowing the pupils and students then to ask questions. The questions are actually, it's a really fun way in which it's done. So it's one of those topics, your gender identity or your sexuality, that in a class full of, let's say, teenagers, not everybody's going to say, I've got a question, put my hand up. Because in essence, you make yourself conspicuous. So we give them pieces of paper, they write the question down, they screw it up, they give it to the facilitator, and then the facilitator asks the questions. There's no knowing who asked it. And you get a lot of the questions which you might expect. So how were your parents when you came out? Through to others which are, far more touching, really. There'll be a note which says, I think I'm gay, but I don't know what to do. So I've seen with my own eyes the impact it has. For those who are straight, it helps them understand how they could challenge bullying behaviour. The problem with that boy I mentioned, Dominic, was nobody knew. The parents didn't know, teachers didn't know, and I'm sure children did know. But it's encouraging that response now to say, well, if you know this is going on, feel confident about either challenging it yourself, of course, or going to a teacher or somebody. It doesn't have to be a teacher. It can be a person, a supervisor in the playground. It could be the person serving you food at lunchtime. We call it being an upstander rather than a bystander. So for the majority of the class who are straight, it is very much about, this is the impact of this behaviour. Probably most of you don't agree with this, and this is how you can be an upstander. And then for what will typically be the much smaller number of young people in the class who may be in themselves openly LGBTQ, or going through that process of thinking they are, discovering themselves, is to see somebody say, you're not alone. And I went through stuff, but look at me now. And give them a little bit of hope and confidence about the future. It's a very impactful way of building empathy and kindness. Having said that, we reach less than 1% of schools each year. It is still very difficult for a young person to come out at school. And our recent impact study showed that the single biggest driver of bullying at school is gender identity or being perceived as being gay or being gay. So I see a greater awareness of the issue, but it's still very tough in that environment to come out.
So you say about awareness. So if you think about when you grew up and I grew up, I can't think about, when I think about school and if there was anyone within that community, there's one person I can remember, but he certainly didn't come out, and I would have never confirmed it if it did or not. But if they did when I was going to school, absolutely they would have been bullied. There's no question. And I can only imagine that is possibly the hardest time, because you're trying to discover yourself, trying to understand who you are. And then at the same time, if you talk to somebody, even if it's someone that's trusted, you know that you might have an adverse reaction. So from all those years ago, I'm thinking 30 years ago I was at school, to now, and you mentioned the word awareness, what's happened in that period? So if Dominic was 12 years ago, by the way, that was a harrowing story. I mean, I had shivers when you shared it with me. That's just unbelievably sad. So I can understand the real mission behind that, because that cannot happen. That just cannot happen. And, you know, I love the fact that you're taking that head on to ensure it doesn't. I'm thinking about little Logan, and whatever little Logan, when he's a bit older, chooses to be, I just want him to be healthy and happy and kind, empathy, considerate. That's all I want for him. And he can make whatever choices he wants to make. So that, you know, the future you're trying to build for my children is one I absolutely want. So there's that awareness. Where are we in this awareness journey? Like I mentioned, 30 years ago, there wasn't any, definitely not, to Dominic and to today's position.
Well, I'll come into that awareness journey, but I'll go back to what you're talking about with your son, because I had a conversation with another CEO that we might do business with, and we talk about our mission. And he was saying, you know, we're really concerned about our child's upbringing and teaching them, you know, what to do in case they're bullied. And I said, maybe think about putting effort into teaching them not to bully. Because if the attitudes and behaviours are stressing, don't bully, then there won't be any bullying. We won't need to tell people what to do if you are bullied, because it will be such an unusual occurrence. At the moment, it's not an unusual occurrence. So I think every parent or carer can, from a very early age, help their child have the behaviours that are non-bullying.
Yeah,
I would say it's a sort of key thing. But going back to an awareness, as you've pointed out many times, Simon, I'm slightly older than you. So I went to school in the 80s, and back then there were essentially gay and lesbian were concepts. That was it. And there was a phrase that, for gay men in particular, you were mad, bad and sad.
Okay.
Being gay back then was a psychological disorder. It wasn't removed as such, even by the World Health Organization, I think until the 90s, or early 2000s. So you were ill, mentally ill. You were bad because, you know, this is against the Bible and it's against the family. And you were sad because you have no friends, you'll probably get sick and die, you'll never get a job. So that was the awareness. You know, if you're going to come out as gay, your life's over. And the idea of talking about it in any kind of objective, and it's just out of the question. I mean, for me, it was silence, just absolute silence. It was a topic that would not be discussed if you could in any way avoid doing so. And if it was discussed, it'd be a wholly negative way. And the worst thing you could call somebody, ironically back then, was queer. It's actually been taken as a word the community used to describe itself, but back then was queer or puff. So I just remember thinking, it's something that happens to other people far, far away. So awareness of my generation, sort of zero, absolutely zero. by the time I got to university, so now we are in the 90s, and you have back then, which was the LGB society, lesbian, gay, bisexual. I went to a very masculine, cultured campus. Everybody there was studying PE, sport, almost everybody. And there were some faculties which were more arts related. So if there was an LGB society, they wouldn't come from the sports at all. They'd come from that. And I would say they were viewed with derision as being bad and sad, to be honest. Still, even in the 90s, viewed as that. Perhaps the offensive nature of it was a little less, but no inclusion. That was a group over there. It was separate from the rest of us. And it kind of underscored for me, from a very early age, that being gay was the opposite of being a man, is what I was taught. So if you were gay, you didn't play any sports, you didn't really have any friends, you didn't have an interest in men's things, you didn't dress like a man, you'd more dress as the words I've just mentioned. And so for many people like me growing up, you had this strong confusion, which is, well, I do like sports, I do like hanging with my mates and doing all the things my mates do, but I know I'm gay, so it's a real confusion. I don't know what's going on here. So I just said to myself, I think what I am is I'm just a straight guy like everybody else here, but I fancy other guys now and then, and I presume that's what everybody's like, but we just don't talk about it. It's how you kind of reconcile it, which of course is untrue. But in the absence of any role model anywhere, even on television, the characters there wouldn't be regular stories. There'd be something about it. So either to be outrageously flamboyant and comic, or the story would inevitably be tragic. Tragic end to this gay man. You just had to kind of reconcile it in your head about what you were. And it wasn't until a really close friend of mine, we were in the same team, both played cricket for the university. I was actually captain. He was a lot better than me, in all fairness. And he was a blokey, rugby, cricket, pint down the pub, a blokey bloke. And he said, I just tell him, I need to speak to somebody. And he came out to me.
Wow.
And for the first time I thought, he's just like me. First time ever, I thought, he's just like me. This is a guy who's just like me. He likes the same things as me. All our outlook on life is the same. And it was the start for me to think, this stereotype of being gay, lesbian, all of our community have a stereotype. It's so toxically wrong. It's created deliberately to try to discourage, prevent, isolate people from being themselves. It was the first time I realised, there's somebody just like me. I can be that person. I didn't come out for a little while after that. But for me, that's the power of role model, that ability to relate and then feel confident in being yourself.
In that situation where your friend, I imagine he was in your cricket team, came out to you, how did you respond to that?
I was... is flattered the right word?
Because I was thinking he must have really trusted you to have come out to you.
But yeah, I'd imagine so.
There must be huge trust there.
So, yeah, you feel that sense of being entrusted with this significant secret.
And there's got to be, he must have had a level of, trust, but safety, knowing that he could share, he needed to share, and he's come to you first.
Yeah.
And That's why I just said that's an incredible thing that he's come to you first.
And there must have been something in the way I conducted myself that gave him the feeling, maybe picked up that, even though I wouldn't have called myself gay then, maybe picked up on that, or maybe you just can sometimes tell. This is an individual, we've never talked about it, I can just tell from their personality that it's not going to change how they feel about me. So you feel that sense of empathy and a desire to support them, to follow whatever their wishes there were. And he didn't want it to be broadcast, understandably so. But I say for me, the profound part of the story is, for the first time ever, I've realised that I could be the person I was and not change anything about me and be gay. Whereas until that, it felt like a really significant conflict. That the two were not compatible, because I'd been told they were not compatible, from the moment I could comprehend anything.
That must have been playing on your mind for many years. I can't even imagine what that could have been like.
I think everybody's position when they find it is a different. They cope with it in different ways, and it's a state of normality. It's hard for me to say anything other than, for me, it was a state of normality. That's just how it was. But for other people, it might be kind of chronically oppressive to their happiness.
Yeah.
It is. All I know was, until my friend spoke to me, coming out was something I would never do.
Right.
It was not going to happen. If I had to find a girlfriend and settle down, I would do that. Really?
So you'd have even gone that far, which was because it just you wouldn't have felt it would have been accepted.
I would
enough,
have.
or
Yeah, I genuinely felt I just would not be able to. I had been effectively told, I think you've got, you'll lose. And need to kind of remember, this is well over 25 years ago.
Yeah,
it's a generation ago. And even at the time, you think you're living in a modern, it's significantly less modern than it is now. So, it was just inconceivable that I could come out and keep everything that I'd held dear, my friends, what I was studying, playing in the teams I played for, all those things. It was just totally inconceivable.
So in your mind, you're thinking, if I share this with anyone, all those things and everything that you've built in your life, your sporting achievements, the captain of the cricket team, you would lose all of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not a rational belief, because you're kind of told this. And we're not talking about playing in the cricket team and everybody's diversity trained and very mindful of the language. Every slur, more or less, is a gay slur.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I've been to many football matches, and that's the sort of thing that's shouted. When you're in the group, and there are things that will be shouted, and sometimes that's just to spook the other player or the other team, just to make them play bad. It's just, there's so many connotations. There's so many times that has happened. Certainly back at that, those many years ago, that was almost part of the culture.
It is, yeah. It's a phrase, is toxic masculinity, in which the extreme end of the view of what it is to be a man is the prevailing culture. So you don't get just homophobia, you get extreme sexism, you get extreme racism, you get this very distorted view of what it is to be a man. And you see it in all kinds of cultures, but you see it, certainly back then, you saw it writ large in sport in particular.
Moving a bit closer to modern day and the impact of social media, and I don't know, thinking 12 years ago with poor Dominic, if that paid an impact. I imagine social media was probably beginning. YouTube was around, it's in its infancy, but people using Facebook and Instagram not so much. But would that have played a part of this as well? Because it's not just the bullying in the playground; it's going home. It's the videos being, because mobile phones are now available. People are using mobile phones. You can start to share videos with people. Was social media? So my question is, what impact is social media playing in all of this now? Because I think in today's real, true modern times, it actually can be used for a positive, in the fact that, you know, you can get the right messages out across social media. You know, there's far more awareness now because of social media. But also I feel like, but then the negative is almost that whatever's happening in the school playground can then continue to happen online at home, which could be really damaging. I mean, what role are you seeing social media play?
It was massive. When I was at school, you could only be bullied in person.
Yeah.
That was the only way. You could avoid kids. You wouldn't be bullied. Now, there is no hiding place at all. So in Dominic's story, it was filmed and shared. I have no idea how it was shared or what platforms it was shared. So cyberbullying is the ability to essentially terrorise somebody 24/7. And it happens a lot. And you will never put the genie back in that bottle. You know, social media is not going to go away. And whilst it's under its current format, it'll probably be the principal tool of bullying.
Really?
Yeah.
Because that means the person who's doing the bullying, or the people that are doing, the groups that are doing the bullying, can hide.
Yet there's absolutely, hide or not hide, unless you as a child are prepared to disconnect yourself from that. Incidentally, I don't use social media. Apart from LinkedIn, I don't use it, no interest in it. But I grew up in a time where I had a childhood without it, so I can do that. But to say to a 14-year-old now, oh, let's switch off your socials, it'd be like saying to us, I'm going to take your car away. It'd be like, no, it's part of my life. So unless you're prepared to do that, it is a feature of bullying that it will be used and is being used to extend bullying from the physical and the time-bound, which is school, to when you finish school, at the weekend, in the holidays, to extend it beyond people who even know you, have never heard of you, don't know the first thing about you, to bring them into it as well. It is as somebody who doesn't have children myself, it is one of the things I'm relieved I would never have to worry about. Because, in Dominic's case, as in so many young people, the lack of confidence to talk about it is a key issue we need to overcome. But at school, you would have, as a parent, you might have some confidence. Well, there's teachers there, there's other people who could intervene. But when they're alone in the room on their phone, who's there to intervene? So, cyberbullying, and it isn't just LGBTQ+. Children, people get bullied for all kinds of reasons.
Of course, yeah.
Is, it's a major, I think, issue for parents and families and carers, most definitely, to, I think, have a dialogue with the children, to have that kind of transparency we talked about, that children feel they can talk to the parents and that it will stop. But in the case I mentioned of young Dominic, for whatever the circumstances were, he was unable to get that intervention.
So at Diversity Role Models, what steps, how are you working with the schools? So there's even then there's a number of factors. There's of course the age of the people that you're working with and when you can start to bring in the awareness. It's the culture of the school. So imagine there's something working with teachers so they understand. What's your approach? How are you working? And also, I suppose in some respects, I'm beginning to think about just the significant changes you go from when you're 8 to when you're 16. that's completely different. So how are you beginning to work with those different age groups, and what sort of information are you sharing, and how are you working with those?
Sure. So primary, the work we do is very much about difference. So it's much more talking, particularly about different families. So our work will focus upon a child having two mums, for example. So it's much more about a general difference and about family structures that might be different to the one they experience or see on TV, etc. And what we're just trying to, or what we're aiming to do there, is the acceptance that there's difference, and understanding of why there is difference, and building in at that age appropriate level that empathy for difference. When we get to senior school, then the content will be adapted accordingly. So now we will talk more about what LGBTQ plus stands for. So in all fairness, in every session I've been to, the kids know that, and they've most likely got that from the school. We'll talk about things like pronouns for people whose gender identity means they want to be quite clear in the pronoun that they use. It might be a pronoun that is different from what a person initially assumes. We will talk then much more about what can be done to challenge what we call HBT, which is homophobia, biphobia, transphobia. So we then go into talking about we don't necessarily say what are the examples you have heard, but we'll use one example, and it's the phrase, "that's so gay." So we'll sort of explore that. We'll work with the class. Well, have you ever put your hand up if you've heard it? They do that by closing their eyes, putting their arm over their face, and they put their hand up. So it's almost like an anonymous survey. And then we'll ask a question. Put your hand up if you think it's easy to come out at this school. In exactly the same format, put the hand up. And then after we've done some further input and heard from the role models, we'll go and ask the same sort of question, but this time we'll, who would feel confident in challenging the phrase "that's so gay"? And you're seeing hands go up. So you're trying to, in a very short period of time, sort of take a snapshot of a kind of an instant impact on their attitude and behaviour. But the heart of it, in both, is the role model. So the heart of it is a story. There's a bit of content, a bit of structure, but the heart of it is a story, which is always unique to the individual, and the opportunity for the class to interact with that role model and their story and ask the questions, some of which maybe they've been dying to ask but never had the opportunity, and some of which are just very pertinent to them. Examples might be, get some really subtle ones. How did your religious community react? You get a question like that because the young person who submitted it might come from a religious family. So it is always, each one is different, each story told is unique, and the questions, whilst you always get some very similar ones, can be quite unique as well.
Is there, thinking about the community and having to come out and then linking that with religion, which means, I can only start to think about some of the challenges now, which you've been you faced and you're sharing that other people have faced when they've had to come out. But then I can only imagine the level of confusion that somebody might have if then you have a religious upbringing, which, then is, I don't know, I want to say the word banned, I don't know, but then it's made that forbidden. That's the word I'm looking for. It's made that preference forbidden. And in some countries it still is. What's going through someone's head at that stage? The level of confusion and conflict, I don't even know. How can you even start to help somebody with that?
Well, it's a challenge. If you're brought up being told what you are is wrong, that you'll be potentially thrown out of the family, thrown out of the community and everybody you know, that's not a healthy position for anybody.
You talked about your fear was losing everything, which is what you've been told. Now, this person, if they've got a religious belief, is going to lose their family. They're going to lose their beliefs. I mean, it's they could lose all of their being up until that stage just from having two beliefs. One was a religious belief, which also is a choice, a preference. It's due to the culture of the family, and then another belief or a preference. It's just unbelievable, really, that people have to go through this. Then you add on social media. I just think this role that you've taken is so incredibly challenging.
Yeah, I mean, I would never describe somebody's sexuality as a preference.
Sorry, yeah.
I wouldn't necessarily describe somebody's religious belief as a preference, but certainly there's a conflict between the two, potential conflict between the two, which is why the role model story is so important, because there's no one story. There'll be some role model stories which say, I had to give all that up. However, I have a different life now, and I'm in a relationship, or I have this job, and I have children, and I'm happy. So the whole idea in those stories to say, yeah, sometimes you lose something, but it doesn't mean you don't gain something in return. And then others come back with actually, the love of the family or the community they're part of was greater than whatever the view of that religion was, and they've managed to maintain that in some way, to find an accommodation with it. So each story is very different, and finding role models who have a religious background is a particular challenge for us, probably because of those obstacles I just mentioned.
So the role models, these are volunteers, and they, as part of the approach that you have with the schools, is they come in and they share their story, which would be a bit about their background, and then they would sort of communicate that to the school children of the varying different ages.
Yeah, it is literally a 5-minute story. So we'll have done some training with them, because clearly life stories are longer than 5 minutes, to kind of bring it into a nice, succinct 4 or 5 minute tale. And it is designed, I mean, the whole part of it is designed that the people listening build empathy. I think whenever you come into contact with another human being and they tell you about themselves, about the things they've been through, even if you've not been through that, you can always empathise, because a person who's coming out and found their friend rejected them, another person might think, well, I know what rejection is like. Not for that reason, but I do know what it's like to be rejected. Or a person who is trans and has found themselves excluded from friends. Other people will say, well, I'm not trans myself, but I understand, and I can feel that pain, and in my head, I'd hate that to happen to me. So the power of that story, even if it's only 5 minutes, is very much built around the experience and the impact upon the person. Success, adversity, fear, hope, all these things. But of course, in our case, many of those role models, I then also say, and look at my story now. And that's highly varied. It could be anything, but look at my story now. Despite all of the things that I thought would happen or did happen, beside all things society was saying about me, look at me now. And that is the key message to reach out to anyone there who's feeling really isolated and fearful. It's like, there's hope. It's going to be okay. And by and large, for the vast majority, it is going to be okay.
So for someone listening now who maybe hasn't shared or hasn't come out, what advice maybe would you be able to offer them, or thoughts in terms of if you're going to come out and it's sort of in today's modern world, whether you wait, you hold back, you share it with a friend, or what do you think? I mean, I know this is an impossible question in some respects because it's down to the individual, but what guidelines could you offer?
All I can really say is my personal experience. I would never advise how, when, to whom to come out. It's impossible. So I can just tell my experience. First and foremost, we sometimes underestimate our parents. Perhaps our whole lives we underestimate our parents. But the first thing I realised is your parents' capacity to love you is boundless. And in my case, I perhaps underestimated that and thinking this would be a real problem for them and it would change how they view me. But it doesn't. It didn't in any part of the family. So that's my stereotype of older people in my family, was they won't understand, they won't accept me. So I think for my experiences, I underestimated that care and love that existed for me, irrespective of who I was. I think in my experience as well, although he came out to me, so I was the person listening, there will often be somebody in your life. It might not be a friend. It might be a teacher, for example. There will invariably be somebody who will listen to you without judgment. It will just listen to you and confidentially. And for my friend, it was me. So that's two things. And then if I was to give some advice for a young person, there are several confidential organisations that you can just reach out to. So there's Switchboard and there's Proud Trust, very much set up to talk to young people, just to help someone who might think, I'm alone in this. There's nobody like me in the school, in the town, at all. Just to have somebody to speak to who says, well, actually, I'm like you. So talk to me and see. Might just be just that. So I don't wish to be unduly optimistic, because you always hear very moving and sometimes very sad stories, and Dominic being a good example. But most people are really good. Your families do love you. Teachers and teaching staff are very passionate about this and protecting and caring for children. And by and large, and it will vary, there'll be somebody in your life who, like me, will take that responsibility of hearing your story, of how you're feeling, very seriously. I want to protect you and help you through it.
That's incredible. It's incredible. And I think what you said about parents, I think they play probably one of the most important parts in having empathy and understanding. And like I said, however Logan, or if we have more children in the future, whatever they decide is what they decide. And but I do think that's a sign of the times, because I do think back, and I think some of the older generations from many, many years ago certainly wouldn't understand it. And again, I'm stereotyping, but I've heard, comments and people have said things. And, but I also agree with you in the fact of this must be a really scary time because of social media, because of that. You can't get away from it. It just is, there's you can't get away from the bullying side of things potentially, and being connected constantly. I think there's definitely some downsides to that.
Yeah, I think it's so hard for me because not using it, I do get away from it. I've no interest in it. So I'm never in that space. I think in this modern age, any work that schools do on anti-bullying has to include that.
Yeah.
It has to provide young people and parents with mechanisms. Well, I think that people are touching base with each other. I think that's the sort of key thing, is constantly touching base. I think I'm on my phone, I average about 2 hours a day. And I saw another phone, and it came up and said, your average is 11 hours a day. And you think, imagine 5 hours of that was bullying.
Wow, yeah.
So say it was every day, 35 hours a week of bullying. So, I just say to young people and parents and check in on this, most definitely.
So I think you're about 6 months into your new role. Is that
Four.
Right? 4 months.
Just over 4, yeah.
4 months. So what's the future? So over the next year to 2 years, what are you hoping to achieve? I'm really hoping that this is something that you can make successful and bring the awareness to school. Certainly for my children, but also I just think this is the right time. I love the meaning and purpose behind it, and I think that probably gives you, a lot of motivation, but also a feeling of real pride that you're making a huge difference. Huge difference. What does the future look like?
So to increase the number of schools is key. So to grow our footprint. Within that, to have a very strong focus on disadvantaged areas. There's a concept called intersectionality, which it goes a bit like this. Let's say you are a white man, you're straight, you're middle class. The obstacles placed in your path will be less than a white, middle class, gay man. And then you can go through all this intersectionality. So if you are a black female who's a lesbian, those obstacles are compounded. They're compounded. You'll face obstacles because you're black, because you're a woman, because you're a lesbian. And so within growing the schools, we want to have greater focus in disadvantaged areas where we're likely to see greater ethnic diversity, young people who come from disadvantaged backgrounds. So people who may already face obstacles in life because of one feature of themselves or their background, and for whom being LGBTQ plus adds to those obstacles. So that for me, I'm very passionate about that, and that will steer us quite a lot to communities in the north, coastal communities, some cut off, isolated rural communities. So I see that's been quite a big focus. And the other part is to include and bring in parents and carers more to the work that we do. I think it's a really fast-moving social change. So the awareness or concept of, say, being transgender, it really didn't exist when I was younger. And as things move quite quickly, it's incumbent upon organisations like mine to help parents understand. So it's great for the kids to go to school and get that understanding. But if the parents aren't equally well equipped, those attitudes and behaviours might not be reinforced. And we've always, in our sector, had a real recognition that for people who are not LGBTQ, fear of saying the wrong thing is a great fear amongst people. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to handle it. I don't know what that means. And so for me, over this next year, really bringing parents and carers into that and say, well, why don't I tell you some of the things that we talk about in workshops? It doesn't have to be particularly long, but things about pronouns, why they exist, how they get used. Some of what does LGBTQIAAP stand for? In all fairness, a couple of years ago, I didn't know that either. So that kind of empathy and compassion and kindness is a conversation that is not just had in the classroom, but it's had around, I know this sounds very old-fashioned, around the dinner table or in the garden, or when you're going out on a family trip. So I think it's really important that we continue expanding the work we do with young people. I think we also should extend that to parents and carers as well.
I think that's one of the bits I was going to ask you about, because educating children that are at school is one element of that. But really, I think where you're going to start to really make the huge shifts is that if parents, if teachers, if this is open conversation, like you said, around the dinner table, and it's something where it can just be discussed, it can just be part of an open conversation where you feel like you can go and communicate to your parents. But not just that, the parents are also ready to hear that, because that might be very difficult for a parent to hear, or it might not be. And I suppose they need to be equipped, and I think that response and how they communicate is an incredibly important part to that. What work can you do with a parent, through whether it's through the school or in a community, to make them aware, but make them almost prepared if this is the situation?
Yeah, I mean, many parents may get input through their own workplace.
Yeah.
So it does go on. I think what we can do is always going to be limited. I mean, kids have to be at school.
Yeah.
So whatever we put on is always going to be a voluntary. So we'll probably run sessions at a suitably convenient time where parents can just drop in. So if we are going to be in an area, maybe there's some schools who invited us in, we're going to drop-in session, we'll talk about some of the work we're going to do. Maybe you could watch one of the role model stories as an example, and you just ask some questions. 90% of people who attend that will be, I'm genuinely interested. But you will, we accept you'll get people who attend who are opposed, to any input of that description whatsoever. But that's the world we live in. My task is to help and support parents and carers who would like that. For those who don't like it and don't want it, there's not an awful lot I can do about that. So I see that as part of the process, but it's very much driven by parents and carers themselves. If they want it, it'll be there. We're putting it on. We produce lots and lots of online videos. So all of the probably about 100 role model stories. So people can visit our YouTube channel and see any of those at any time. Just get a feel for the sort of story that's told in the classroom. But I won't hide the fact that it is a monumental challenge. It is cultural and it is behavioural, and behavioural change is the hardest change to affect, most definitely.
And I can only imagine this is it's going to take years. It's almost a point that this work could possibly never be done.
I suppose when I was 16, it was against the law for a teacher to talk about same-sex relationships.
Wow.
And remained against the law until 2003. And here we are 20 years later in schools with role models talking about their relationships. Things can move far more quickly than you expect. And one of our role models I met last week who filmed, when he was at school, you could be imprisoned for being gay.
Yeah.
So I'm a half glass full person. I've seen rapid change, positive change. You occasionally encounter pushbacks and reaction to that change. But if there's any hope, it is in the kids.
That's a wonderful note to end on. So, Matt, thank you so much for coming in today. It's been a real pleasure. That's been an incredible conversation, and I really hope this conversation is going to help people. Certainly people that maybe will be in that situation you faced, Dominic's faced, And I just hope there's this real awareness now that everyone should be accepted for who they are. And I think that's the end message that I want, is just people just need to be who they are and they should be accepted for that.
And I think people watching this feel passionate about it. I'm sure our website will be on some part of this podcast. Get involved. You might want to tell your story and be a role model, or you might want to donate, because everything we do is reliant upon people who support us.
Thank you so much for your time today, Matt.
Pleasure, Simon. Great to see you again.
Thank you. Take care.